A few miles east of Jericho, there's a spot on the Jordan River traditionally identified as the very place where Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. And if you visit there today, chances are you'll see groups of Christians gathering there, dressed in white robes, standing barefoot in the shallows, waiting their turn to be baptized. But if you know a thing or two about Christianity, you'll know that baptism often doesn't look like this. For the majority of Christians today, especially in Catholic, Orthodox, and some Protestant traditions, baptism usually involves baptizing infants. Sometimes baptism involves just a few drops of water sprinkled or poured over the baby's head. In others, it's full immersion. Infants are dunked 3 times in a baptismal font. No matter the method though, it's a far cry from the image of a grown adult being immersed in a flowing river. These two scenarios show how the central initiation ritual of Christianity looks different depending on the church tradition and cultural context. And one of the most significant differences is the age of the one being baptized. And this is not just a minor theological footnote, it's been a source of intense debate in Christian history. For example, in early modern Europe, a group called the Anabaptists rejected infant baptism altogether, insisting that only adults who could make a personal confession of faith should be baptized. For that belief, many of them were arrested, exiled, or even executed. So if baptizing Jesus as an adult is the most recognizable symbol of this initiation ritual, where did the practice of baptizing babies come from in the first place? In the earliest decades of Christianity, Christians modeled baptism after ancient Jewish purification practices, particularly those of John the Baptist. The word baptism itself comes from the Greek baptizo, meaning to be immersed or plunge. It can also mean to dip, as in dipping a sponge into water or a blacksmith dipping a heated metal rod into water. Though in ritual contexts, the term often refers to ritual washing. Ancient Judaism included a range of water-based cleansing rituals, including washing your hands before eating, the Jewish high priest bathing his body before entering the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple, and bathing after entering a state of ritual impurity for a variety of reasons. Many synagogues and private homes during the lifetime of John the Baptist were even equipped with a mikveh, a ritual bath designed for full-body immersion for ritual cleansing. What you're looking at here is an example from the town of Magdala on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, an ancient mikveh roughly contemporaneous with the lifetime of Jesus. We see an early variation of these customs in the practice of John the Baptist, who called people to repent from sin to prepare them for the coming kingdom of God. Those who responded to his message were immersed in water, not to cleanse themselves after entering a state of ritual impurity, but because they wanted to signal their response to his call. John's practice diverged from earlier Jewish purification rituals in 2 key ways. First, it was administered by someone else, unlike most Jewish purification rituals which were self-administered. Second, it was apparently performed only once, a single, decisive, transformative act that signals entry into a religious community, rather than a ritual that's meant to be repeated regularly to maintain ritual purity. Now, John the Baptist wasn't the only Jew in the first century innovating new communal water rituals that signal moral transformation. Around the same time, another Jewish group was developing its own purification rituals, living in a desert settlement near the Dead Sea, at a site called Qumran. This group is associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered nearby, along with evidence of a highly organized Jewish sect. Many scholars associate the Qumran community with a Jewish sect called the Essenes, described by the first-century Jewish historian Josephus as a group deeply concerned with purity, piety, and separation from broader society. According to Josephus, new members of the Essenes had to undergo a ritual bath in cold water before they were allowed to participate in the community's meals. And one of the scrolls discovered at Qumran, called the Community Rule, seems to have been their community handbook, and it offers a parallel description of how new initiates were spiritually and ritually purified. For it is through the spirit of true counsel concerning the ways of man that all his sins shall be expiated. And when his flesh is sprinkled with purifying waters and sanctified by cleansing water, it shall be made clean by the humble submission of his soul to all the precepts of God. Like John's baptism, these practices framed water purification as a symbol of moral renewal and readiness to join a holy community. The Qumran settlement also included multiple stepped pools, likely used for various ritual immersions. So John wasn't innovating out of nowhere. Like the Essenes at Qumran, he was reworking existing Jewish ideas about water and purity, but his version did set the stage for Christian baptism as a one-time, publicly performed initiation into a community. But where do the babies come in? According to most scholarly treatments of this issue, Christians originally baptized new members as adults and most often with full immersion. And when we look at the earliest Christian writings, we do see that the people being baptized are adults. A key example is the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8. In that story, one of the earliest Christian evangelists, Philip, encounters an Ethiopian court official traveling home from Jerusalem. The man is reading from the book of Isaiah and seems puzzled by what he's reading. Philip joins him in the chariot, explains how the passage relates to Jesus, and then preaches the gospel to him. Moved by the message, the eunuch then points to a body of water and says, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" And so Philip baptizes him on the spot. There's no mention of family members or children, just one adult convert getting dunked. The scholar Everett Ferguson advocates for this view, arguing that adult baptism was the original norm, with infant baptism a later development. According to him, infant or childhood baptism arose later only as an emergency measure when an infant or young child was facing imminent death. According to Ferguson's model, a major shift occurred in late antiquity because of influential thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, who helped to popularize the doctrine of original sin, the idea that all human beings, even newborns, inherit the guilt of Adam and Eve. Ferguson writes, with the victory of Augustine's arguments, original sin became the reason for infant baptism in the Western Church. And once this idea took hold, the logic behind baptism shifted. Baptizing babies wasn't just about precaution anymore, it became a theological necessity. According to Ferguson, by the 5th and 6th centuries, infant baptism had become the standard practice throughout much of the Christian world, and it would remain the norm throughout the Middle Ages and beyond until the Protestant Reformation sparked a major revolution. Like I mentioned at the start, reform groups like the Anabaptists rejected infant baptism altogether, insisting that true baptism required personal belief. They claimed that this was a return to the original model of the early church, and this resulted in the diversity of baptismal practices we see today. So we can call this the Adult-Full-Immersion-With-Exceptions model. Now, Ferguson doesn't deny there were exceptions. For example, he acknowledges that the early Christian text called the Didache mentions how you can practice baptism either through immersion or pouring. But for him, adult full-immersion baptism was clearly the norm. But in recent years, scholars have started to think that those so-called exceptions were actually more common than we thought. In a direct response to Ferguson, the scholar of early Christian art and architecture Robin Jensen cautions against the idea that there was ever a normative way that early Christians practiced baptism. Our earliest evidence, whether textual, artistic, or archaeological, just doesn't support that kind of neat narrative. The evidence from the 2nd to 7th centuries paints a picture of diversity of how people were baptized and who was being baptized. So, for example, it seems that a lot of babies were being baptized long before Augustine, and not only in emergency cases. Explicit references to infant baptism show up as early as the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE in the writings of Tertullian, one of the earliest Latin theologians of Christianity. In his treatise on baptism, Tertullian does not introduce infant baptism as some sort of new innovation. Instead, he complains that it's already a common practice, and he's concerned that children are being baptized before they are able to know Christ. This is a problem for Tertullian because he worries that someone being baptized too early might later fall into sin and jeopardize their salvation. Baptism, after all, is meant to be a one-time, unrepeatable cleansing, so sinning after baptism could have serious spiritual consequences. His advice? Well, delay baptism until a child is old enough to understand the faith and live it out. He writes, "So let them come when they are nearer maturity, when they are learning, when they are being taught what is that they are coming to. Let them be made Christians when they are able to know Christ. Why should the innocent one rush to the remission of sins?" Now, Tertullian clearly opposes infant baptism, but the very fact that he argues against it tells us something important. He references the baptism of little children and mentions sponsors giving promissiones, or binding guarantees on behalf of the child's future conduct. That not only shows that the practice was already well established in North Africa by his lifetime, but it also shows that it was not in response to the child's imminent death. There's not much use making a binding guarantee of the child's future conduct if you're expecting the child to die soon. So it seems that Tertullian was not responding to a new or fringe idea. He was pushing back against something that many Christians around him were already doing, and that bothered him. Other early Christian theologians around this time, such as Cyprian, Origen of Alexandria, and the writer of the liturgical text called the Apostolic Tradition, also describe infant baptism. And in the case of Cyprian, he expresses clear support for it. Writing to a fellow bishop named Fidus in the 250 CE, Cyprian responded to a concern. Fidus had questioned whether it was appropriate to baptize infants before the 8th day after birth, drawing on the biblical precedent of circumcision, which was traditionally done on the 8th day. Cyprian rejected this comparison, saying that baptism was not bound to that timeline and should not be delayed. In fact, he argued that a newborn should be baptized immediately. For Cyprian, divine grace and the gift of the Holy Spirit are not measured by age, so in his view, delaying baptism would just be denying a newborn access to God's mercy. He writes, "And therefore, dearest brother, this was our opinion and counsel. No one ought to be hindered from baptism and from the grace of God, which we think is to be even more observed in respect of infants and newly born persons, who on this very account deserve more from our help and from the divine mercy. In other words, Cyprian saw baptism not as something to postpone until a child could understand it, but as an act of mercy. For him, even the youngest newborns were in need of divine grace, and withholding baptism, even just for a few days, meant withholding the very means of divine mercy. Also writing in the 200s, the theologian Origen writes, "In the Church, baptism is given for the remission of sins, and according to the usage of the Church, baptism is given even to infants." In his commentary on the book of Romans, he even claims infant baptism was a practice received from the apostles themselves. And finally, the apostolic traditions, which may also date to the 3rd century CE, explicitly says that little children are to be baptized even before they're able to speak. "And they shall baptize the little children first, and if they can answer for themselves, let them answer. But if they cannot, let their parents or someone from their family answer for them." So those are among the earliest explicit mentions of infant baptism, with Tertullian probably being the oldest mention, but the practice may reach back even earlier than figures like Tertullian or Cyprian, perhaps as far back as the 2nd century or even the 1st century. The theologian Irenaeus, writing in the late 2nd century, approvingly mentions infants and small children who are born again in God. Now, it's a brief and ambiguous statement, but many scholars interpret that phrase, born again in God, as a reference to infant baptism. We also find tantalizing hints in the New Testament book of Acts, our earliest extended narrative of Christian baptisms, dating to the late 1st or early 2nd century CE. Acts describes the baptism of entire households. Now, whether that included babies or children is left unsaid. Now, some scholars have argued that the silence of early Christian sources on infant baptism is evidence that it didn't yet exist, but scholars have pointed out that early Christian texts are actually pretty silent on baptismal details in general. For example, the sources generally reference new converts being baptized, but we don't have any specific descriptions of baptizing teenagers or adults that were born into a Christian family, though it almost certainly was happening. So the absence of detailed commentary on infant baptism doesn't necessarily mean it was not practiced. It just means that much of everyday life in Christian communities just wasn't written down. One thought-provoking interpretation of the silence comes from the scholar Stephen Nicoletti. In a 2015 article, Nicoletti doesn't try to force the early Christian sources to say more than they actually say. The book of Acts simply says families. We can try to read between the lines and say that probably includes babies and kids too, but it's hard to squeeze more data out of that simple sentence. Rather than asking why the New Testament doesn't mention infant baptism, he asks what that silence might actually tell us. Nicoletti suggests that the reason early Christian texts don't mention infant baptism might actually be pretty simple. Nobody thought it was a question worth asking. In the Greco-Roman world in the 1st century, it was completely normal to assume that children would be initiated into their parents' religion. It was not something people debated or explained, it just was. And when a speaker and listener share a certain set of assumptions, those assumptions don't need to be stated. To illustrate the point, Nicoletti compares it to the US Declaration of Independence. It famously declares that all men are created equal, and yet says nothing about slavery, even though slavery was deeply entrenched in the colonies that wrote and signed the document. To us today, this seems like a contradiction, but at the time, the document's authors and readers shared a set of unspoken presuppositions, namely that enslaved people didn't count among those equal men. So to a historian, the silence on slavery is not evidence of confusion at the time or that slavery didn't exist, it's evidence of shared consensus. In the same way, Nicoletti argues that the silence on infant baptism in the New Testament may not reflect uncertainty or disagreement or that no one was doing it, but rather a shared presupposition. Children would obviously be brought into the Christian community along with their parents using the Christian initiation ritual of choice, baptism. He backs up his argument by looking at the cultural context of initiation rituals during the 1st century CE. In Judaism, Jewish boys were circumcised on the 8th day after birth as a mark of entry into the covenant. There was no later ritual to bring them officially into the faith. They were simply in. Girls, while not circumcised, were likewise considered full members of the religious community by virtue of being born to Jewish parents. Passages from the compendium of Jewish law called the Mishnah say that kids were expected to participate in temple festivals in Jerusalem as soon as they could walk. Nicoletti argues that because baptism quickly became the Christian rite of initiation, functioning as the moment when someone entered the church and the Christian life, it would have made sense for Jewish converts to extend that rite to their kids.
The same logic applies from converts from Greco-Roman backgrounds. In the Roman Empire during the 1st century CE, infants were often ritually initiated into civic and social life through a naming ceremony called the Dies Lustricus, held around the 8th or 9th day after birth. It involved naming the child, purification rites, and formally incorporating them into the household, which was functionally a religious institution at the time. Kids took part in state rituals, they sang in festivals, and they helped with the household cultic activities. In other words, religious activity was something children grew up participating in as part of their family and civic identity. So when Greek and Roman parents converted to Christianity, they also probably expected their kids to be included in the same way. Ultimately, Nicoletti asks a simple question. What were they doing with the babies? The church had to do something with the kids of converts. Throughout the 1st century, Christianity began expanding rapidly through both Jewish and non-Jewish converts, and as we've seen, converts brought their entire households into the faith. What happened to the babies? Were they left uninitiated, delayed until adolescence? We don't know because we don't get any debate about this in the earliest Christian sources. We don't get letters from Paul to the churches fretting over what to do with the toddlers. That silence, he argues, probably means there was no dispute, just a broadly shared assumption that the kids of Christian parents were included in the community from the start, which is what we see when we consider other initiation rituals of the time, both in Judaism and in traditional Greco-Roman families.
Of course, Nicoletti's argument isn't without its problems. Arguments from silence can cut both ways. Maybe the early sources don't mention infant baptism simply because it wasn't practiced, and no one thought to note its absence. So no, he doesn't solve the debate over infant baptism in the apostolic age once and for all, but he does offer a pretty simple reframing of the silence in our sources. In the 1st century world, baptizing babies would not have been weird. Across Jewish and Greco-Roman cultures, kids were routinely initiated into their family's religion from birth, using an initiation ritual. So if early Christians did not baptize their kids, that would have surprised at least some segments of society, and likely would have sparked debate. But we don't see that, just silence. And for Nicoletti, that silence might reflect quiet agreement. So some scholars argue it's plausible that infant baptism was a fairly common practice by the 2nd century, if Irenaeus is indeed referencing it, and maybe even earlier in the 1st century if entire families were indeed being baptized at once, kids and all. Though at the very least, the practice was apparently widespread enough by around 200 CE to be referenced by Tertullian, Cyprian, and Origen. Now, to be fair to Ferguson, he's not entirely wrong. The earliest baptismal practices we know of, those of John the Baptist, involved adult participants. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian texts, instructs both the one being baptized and the baptizer to fast beforehand, something babies can't exactly do. And in the first few centuries of Christianity, the movement was still expanding primarily through adult conversions, which naturally meant that most baptisms were of adults. Really, the entire debate comes down to this murky, roughly 150-year gap in our evidence between John the Baptist and Tertullian, trying to pinpoint when infant baptism first emerged, and more importantly, when it became routine enough to be recognizable as a widespread practice. By the time of Tertullian in the early 3rd century, it clearly wasn't the majority practice we see today, but it also wasn't exactly new either. Tertullian, Cyprian, and Origen were reacting to the baptism of infants and young kids, not introducing it. Tertullian criticizes it, Cyprian defends it, and Origen describes it as not particularly out of the ordinary. Their testimony suggests that the practice was at least familiar, perhaps even routine in some Christian communities, and not only in the case of emergencies. Origen, Tertullian, and the apostolic tradition don't frame it like that. Tertullian does not mention emergency at all. In fact, he assumes that children are being baptized in ordinary circumstances, and his concern is precisely that it's happening too casually. Also, Origen refers to the baptism of infants as a general usage of the church, without suggesting that it was only reserved for dire circumstances. In both cases, the tone suggests a level of regularity rather than exception, which complicates the idea that early infant baptism was solely a response to crisis.
Now, while we lack definitive evidence for widespread infant baptism before these writers, as I mentioned, there are suggestive earlier hints, like the baptism of entire households in the book of Acts and 1 Corinthians, or Irenaeus' reference to infants being born again in God, which may reflect 1st century family-based baptismal practices that included babies and kids.
At the very least, the evidence points to a more diverse and regionally varied baptismal landscape than Ferguson's model allows. Instead of one norm with rare exceptions, the early Christian world may have always contained a spectrum of baptismal practices, shaped by theology, pastoral concerns, and the messy realities of lived religion on the ground. The archaeological evidence of baptismal fonts also points to a diversity of practice. Baptismal fonts being the basins or receptacles for baptismal water. In a modern Baptist church, a baptismal font may look like a full-sized bathtub or small pool designed for adult immersion. In a Catholic or Orthodox church, you're more likely to see a smaller ornate basin. Ferguson argues that fonts became smaller in the 500 CE as Christian communities shifted toward baptizing infants rather than adults. In his view, earlier, larger fonts with steps and deeper basins were designed for adult full immersion, while smaller, more shallow fonts reflect a ritual now centered on sprinkling or pouring water over babies. But this interpretation raises some problems. For one, it assumes that large fonts can't be used for infants and smaller fonts can't accommodate adults, which is not necessarily true. The logic only holds if you assume that full immersion of adults was the standard mode of practice across the board, but as we've seen, the evidence suggests a wider range of practice from the beginning. In other words, a baby could be dunked in a larger basin, and an adult could be sprinkled standing or kneeling in a smaller one. Surviving fonts from the 300s and early 400s tend to range from about 1 to 3 meters wide and around 1 meter deep. But in her research, Dr. Jensen notes that a lot of the earliest baptismal fonts found in the archaeological record are very small, complicating the idea that full-body immersion of adults was really all that widespread. Jensen argues that the material evidence suggests a wider range of baptismal practices were already in use by the 3rd century, including baptism by pouring and the baptism of babies. The oldest surviving baptismal font ever discovered comes from Dura Europos, a Roman frontier town in modern-day Syria, dated to the mid-3rd century CE. Contemporaneous with the lifetimes of Origen and Cyprian, the baptistry includes a painted chamber and a built-in basin measuring approximately 1.5 meters long, 1 meter wide, and just under 1 meter deep, about the depth of a modern standard bathtub. While this size would have allowed a person to step in and kneel or crouch, it likely was not large enough to permit full body immersion by reclining or laying flat unless you were a particularly small person. A pair of 4th century baptismal fonts from the site of Balalis Mayor in Tunisia are also tiny, one less than 50 centimeters deep and the other about 75 centimeters deep. Consider also this example from Milan and this one from Naples, dating to the 300s and 400s respectively. They're very shallow, barely deep enough to cover someone's knees, let alone immerse an entire adult. The Milan basin is 55 centimeters deep, and the Naples one is only 45 centimeters deep. And even for the fonts that were deeper, they were designed with steps and narrow basins, making it hard to imagine someone being fully submerged without some serious gymnastics. Believe me, I've tried. This is the baptismal font in St. John's Basilica in Ephesus, likely from the 400s or 500 CE, and I can't really see how I could be fully immersed based on some experimental archaeology using my adult human body as a test case. Even if we account for the fact that people in late antiquity may have been shorter on average than today, many of these fonts would not have been deep enough to fully submerge an adult without effort. The deeper ones would have been about hip deep and may have required crouching down and curling up to achieve anything close to full immersion, and even then, with difficulty depending on the steps and the width of the basin. All of this leads Dr. Jensen to conclude, both archaeological remains and iconography from the early church indicate that baptismal immersion was probably less common than documents indicate. Scholars now suggest that in many cases, early Christians may have been practicing partial immersion, standing or kneeling in a baptismal font while water was poured over them, which is how the baptism of Jesus is sometimes depicted in early Christian art. Moreover, the archaeological record doesn't show a clean chronological break as Ferguson suggested, when baptismal fonts supposedly were getting smaller to accommodate babies. As we've seen, small fonts existed well before Augustine, and large adult-sized fonts continued to be built after his lifetime. The font at Bulla Regia in Tunisia, for example, is about 1.5 meters deep, and the font at Calibia in Tunisia measures over 1 meter deep. The same design is seen in other fonts from this period, like this enormous basin near Pompeii, which spans 5.5 meters across. So Jensen concludes, thus the size or depth of fonts cannot offer reliable evidence for a general transition to infant baptism across the board in the 5th or 6th century, any more than it can preclude or prove that baptism was always administered either by submersion or effusion. The archaeological record reinforces what we see in the textual sources. Early Christian baptismal practice was not uniform. Full immersion or partial immersion, sprinkling or pouring, crouching or kneeling, natural flowing water outside or baptismal font inside, infant baptism or adult baptism. They all seem to have coexisted on some level at least from the 3rd century to the 6th century, and possibly earlier. Which brings us back to the doctrine of original sin. For Ferguson and other scholars, this has been viewed as a watershed moment. But we've seen from figures like Tertullian and Origen that Christians were baptizing infants in non-emergency situations centuries before Augustine's lifetime. This has led some scholars to question just how decisive Augustine really was in the story of infant baptism. Maybe original sin was not the initial reason for the popularity of the practice. Some Christian parents, for example, seem to have explicitly rejected the doctrine entirely. In a 5th century epitaph from southern France, the parents of their deceased child identify him as sinless and worthy of eternal bliss. Worthy child, innocent, undarkened by the filth of sin, little Theodosius, whose parents' impurity of mind intended to bury him in the holy baptismal font, was snatched away by shameless death. Yet the ruler of high Olympus will give rest to any member lying beneath the noble sign of the cross, and the child will be heir to Christ. These parents acknowledged their desire for their child to be baptized, but they apparently rejected the logic that such baptism was necessary for the child's salvation. Now, to be fair, Cyprian, who is writing back in the 250s, does seem to lay early groundwork for the logic that Augustine would later systematize. In the same letter we quoted earlier, he defends baptizing babies, saying they've contracted the contagion of the ancient death at birth. But is this original sin theology? Well, not quite. What's being inherited here is death, not sin, and in the same letter, Cyprian indicates that infants themselves remain innocent. But the scholar Maxwell Johnson does say we see the beginnings of a theological justification for infant baptism based on the inherited consequences of Adam's sin. Regardless, the latest studies of early Christian baptism emphasize that the shift to infant baptism as the dominant mode of initiation in Christianity was a gradual evolution, not necessarily spurred by any particular theological change. So why did infant baptism first emerge and grow so popular? The truth is, we just don't know. The earliest centuries of Christian practice are murky, and the motivations behind any particular ritual like infant baptism are not clearly spelled out. But based on the available evidence, scholars have proposed a few plausible explanations.
One theory is that infant baptism might have functioned as a replacement for Jewish circumcision.
Remember that this analogy shows up in that letter of Cyprian. The bishop he was writing to apparently argued that baptism should be delayed into the 8th day to match the timing of circumcision. Cyprian rejected that timeline, but the fact that Fidus made that comparison at all suggests that some early Christians saw infant baptism as a parallel practice, or maybe even a replacement practice. There were also probably personal and social motivations too. Parents may have wanted their children to be officially initiated into the church, regardless of any specific belief about sin. Baptism could simply mark a child's inclusion in Christian life, a sign that they belonged. In this sense, the practice was not driven by theological doctrine. It was shaped by family, tradition, and communal identity. And then there's the reality of high infant mortality in the ancient world. Baptism may have offered reassurance to grieving parents, whatever one believed about the sinfulness of the baby. Again, this seems to be Cyprian's motivation in his letter. He's not really concerned about sin, he's concerned about death. So the act of baptism may have been seen as a kind of protection, reflecting a broader cultural anxiety about death, the afterlife, and making sure one's kid was properly cared for in this world and the next.
Now, if you want to go deeper into early Christian history, I recently sat down for an in-depth interview with Dr. Tom Schmidt. He wrote a new book, Josephus and Jesus, that's making waves in my corner of religious studies. See, in a famous passage, the Jewish historian Josephus mentions Jesus of Nazareth, but most scholars think the passage has been tampered with or outright forged by later Christians. But Dr. Schmidt makes the case that it's authentic, and he even argues that Josephus may have had direct access to eyewitnesses of Jesus' trial and execution. We get into all of it: ancient sources, Christian reception history, and what it means for our understanding of the historical Jesus. And that interview is already available early on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming platform built by creators for creators. It's a home for smart, ambitious, and exclusive content you won't find anywhere else. And if you're already heading over there, check out a couple of my personal favorites, like our new feature-length documentary, 17 Pages. On April 25th, 1986, a paper was published in one of the most prestigious scientific journals, Cell. And over the next decade, that 17-page paper sparked one of the most bitter and high-profile controversies in modern science. How did a routine co-authored study turn into a congressional investigation, a career on the brink of being blown up, and a battle over the very definition of scientific truth? If you're drawn to real-world drama at the intersection of science and politics, I think you'll really like this. To watch it right now, head on over to nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast. With my link, you'll get 40% off an annual subscription, which works out to be just $36 a year or $3 a month. Or if you don't want to think about subscribing ever again, you can get lifetime access for $300. Pay once, get access forever. So go check out my full interview with Dr. Tom Schmidt and dive into some of the most creative, thoughtful content online. Thanks, everyone.